The late afternoon sun slanted through the swaying maples in the park in a golden glow that felt almost apologetic, as if the light itself wanted to soften whatever hurt the day had collected. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and the sweet, clinging tang of someone's lemon soda, and somewhere a distant lawn mower hummed like a steady, indifferent heartbeat. He sat on the worn wooden bench beneath a canopy that trembled with leaves. His suit jacket folded beside him like a discarded armor, and he watched the pond with a gaze that had become more habit than curiosity, the surface glittering with the small, indifferent laughter of ducks. His hands were folded in his lap, large and careful, fingers that could summon entire companies, and close deals with a single signature trembling slightly, as if holding something fragile without knowing what it might be. He had tasted triumph often enough to know its texture, the gleam of polished marble in a lobby, the crisp weight of a sealed envelope bearing a future, but triumph at this hour felt thin and brittle, like a coin under a child's thumb. A secret absence hovered inside him, like a room with one light left on and no one living there. He did not know, not yet, that the light in that room had slowly gone out over the years because he had traded pieces of himself for power, because he had learned to bury the small soft things that made life possible under spreadsheets and boardroom speeches. He did not know, not yet, that a simple, accidental kindness would come to undo him in the gentlest, most unavoidable way. A little girl appeared at the edge of his awareness like a sudden, bright chord striking in the middle of a quiet hymn. She was small, her dress a faded patchwork of florals that had once been loud with color and now whispered of many washings, her hair in two shaky braids tied with mismatched ribbons, and she carried a worn teddy bear with one button eye and a belly stitched with a crooked, earnest thread, a teddy that had clearly lived a larger life than the child it accompanied. She moved with the kind of sure-footedness small children reserve for places they know by memory. She navigated the park with a dignity the adults around her lacked, pausing only to feed a crumb to a pigeon or to touch the cool metal of the water fountain with reverent fingers. Her eyes found the man on the bench like a compass needle snapping north, and for a moment they regarded one another simply, two souls meeting across a stretch of ordinary afternoon. He was an impossibility, in a way that delighted and confused her. A man whose skin shone dark and proud in the sun, whose suit hinted at formality but somehow made complete sense without pretense in a place where sandals and bike helmets were the law. He looked like someone who could buy a sky if he wanted to, and yet he sat with his head slightly bowed as if the weight of everything he'd earned had made him heavy. There was a small crease between his brows that said something more private than tired, a grief that had been softened by habit into the shape of a thoughtful man. The little girl's chest rose with the directness of children. The world registered as a series of immediate needs and answers, and she had learned long ago that when something in the world looked like it might need tending, she could be the one to tend it. She stepped closer, the teddy's ragged ear resting against her palm, and she cleared her throat like an announcer at an invisible parade. "You look sad," she said, with all the simple authority of a sentence that required no explanation. The words landed between them like a soft stone. He blinked, sharply, as if the sound had cut his isolation and also mended a seam. A stranger's child had called him by an interior weather report he had stopped broadcasting. Her voice contained no pity, only the practical observation of a small person who had learned early on to name things so they could be fixed. He found himself smiling, a small, surprised smile that felt almost foreign on his face. It loosened a tension in his shoulders he hadn't realized had been clenched for years. He began, and then the sentence stopped, because who explains sorrow to a child? Who describes the architecture of an absence? The little girl sat at the edge of the bench as if she'd been invited for years, her feet swinging, the teddy's patched knee brushing his shoe. For a long moment neither spoke, and the silence between them was a thing that did not oppress but warmed, like the first cup of tea on a cold morning. She tilted the teddy toward him. "You can take my teddy," she offered, the words tumbling out, earnest and unquestioning, as if handing over a beloved object were the simplest solution to every adult unease. "You look sad. You can have him. He makes you not sad." Her logic was irrefutable. He had earned his fortune in halls that smelled of citrus cleaner and conference coffee, among people whose expressions were polished to a professional sheen, but he had not met a sincerity like this in years. A soft laugh escaped him, barely more than a breath, and it felt like an apology to a part of himself he had kept buttoned up. He reached out before he fully decided he would, his fingers closing around the teddy's threadbare paw with a tenderness that surprised even him. The bear's one button eye caught the light, dull and wise, and for the briefest second he felt less like the man in a suit and more like someone who might still answer to a simpler name. The little girl watched him with a gaze that was untrained in the languages of wealth or social distance. To her, a man who seemed to be without joy deserved the same balm she would give a scraped knee. She expected, perhaps, a quick thank you and then a return to whatever route she had been following through the park. She did not expect his face to change. It softened as the sun softened. Something small and stubborn inside him thawed. He talked to her then, in the way grown people sometimes do when the rules fall away and truth spills through. Halting, honest words falling out like coins from a pocket. He told her, in a voice that was both careful and unburdening, that he had lost someone important not long ago. A sister, a lighthouse in his memory, and that the rooms of his life were quieter because of it. He did not say it all. He gave her the edges of a grief instead of the whole, and that was all she needed. She listened with an attention so complete it felt miraculous. When he finished, not out of narrative completeness but because his throat had tightened, she leaned forward and placed a small, sticky hand on his. Her fingers were cool and steady and shockingly solid against the faint tremor in his. "You can keep him," she said, nodding at the teddy as if confirming an important fact. "Teddy knows how to be brave. He will be your brave bear." He laughed again. Bigger this time, heavier with something that might have been tears. "My brave bear," he repeated, tasting the phrase as if it were an unfamiliar fruit. Around them, the park unfurled its ordinary life. A dog barked, the distant scooter whined like a small complaint. A mother called for a child with the impatience reserved for mundane emergencies. Yet, in the tiny orbit they created, the world felt rearranged. He had been a man of strategy, of plans and outcomes measured in margins and shares, but this child's small sovereign act had nothing to do with balance sheets. It had to do with repair. He was, as the narrator would later insist without irony, moved in a way he had not allowed himself to be moved in a long time. He had always believed that vulnerability was a liability. She had no such belief. She understood need and answered it simply. When she rose to leave, she hesitated, as if making sure she had done everything a person could do. "If you see a man with a blue hat," she said, "tell Teddy to hide. Blue hats are silly. They like telling secrets." She giggled at something private and then ran off, the teddy's new owner watching her go until her small figure merged with the park's tapestry of people and trees. He sat there holding the teddy, a ridiculous and perfect thing in his lap, and felt the old hollow in his chest shift, rearrange, make room for a tenderness he hadn't expected to hold. He stared at the bear until twilight threatened to smear the glittering of the pond, and in that looking he understood something essential. Kindness has weight, and sometimes it is the weight that steadies us. That night, back in an apartment that was all glass and quiet surfaces, he placed the bear on the coffee table as if putting a talisman upon an altar. The bear seemed absurd amid the sleek lines of designer furniture, its patched belly and crooked eye refusing to be anything other than what it was. Tender and small and indestructibly loved. He made tea more out of ritual than because he wanted it, and he found himself talking to the bear, not as a joke but as a confessional. He spoke of boardroom battles and lonely flights and the abstract ache of success that had never filled the other spaces in life. He told the bear about the sister he had lost, and the holiday dinners that would now forever be missing one set of laughter. He spoke until the words loosened something inside him akin to sleep. When he finally fell into bed, he did so with a softness that surprised him. In the nights that followed, the bear became an unassuming companion. It sat with him during late-night work calls muted on the phone, it rested on the passenger seat when he drove without destination, and sometimes it sat across from him at breakfast as if waiting for the emperor's speech. The city's nocturnal hum provided small private rhythms for a man learning how to be less alone. He began to notice other things too. The way the woman who swept the lobby smiled as if remembering a joke. The way the doorman's hands, knotted and strong, trembled when he waved. the way a young intern's laugh could fill a whole corridor. The world, he realized, was layered with soft edges he had traded away. He found himself going back to the park more often, not for deals, not for clients, but because the bench had become an unremarkable shrine where small, decisive kindnesses were once exchanged. He would sit beneath the maples and watch people pass. Students with sketchbooks, lovers with laced fingers, elderly men with stubborn postures, and sometimes, when he felt brave, he handed out a sandwich or paid for a bag of bread from a vendor who looked like he ran on little more than hope. He did these things anonymously at first, slipping envelopes into mailboxes or leaving a few dollars folded on cafe tables. It felt strange to be generous without an audience, and it felt stranger still when that act of generosity made a hollow in him hum with a familiar note. He kept the bear on his kitchen chair like a talisman against the city's indifference, and each day its presence was a quiet pressure reminding him to feel. Weeks passed, and small changes accumulated like dew. He was gentler in emails. He listened longer in meetings. He began to notice the young woman in the elevator who always carried a stack of unpaid bills, and he found himself leaving a discreet transfer with a subject of only one word: keep. He had not yet learned to name this newness, whether it was redemption or merely reaction, but it tasted like rain on dry soil, restorative. She, the child who had given him the bear without ceremony, continued to exist in his periphery. He did not seek her out in a predatory or performative way. That would have been an antithesis of everything her gift had been. Instead, he watched for her like someone who had found a small light in a storm and wanted to know its source without disturbing it. The park held her like a secret. Sometimes she came with the bear, now notably perched on the bench next to an empty shoe or a dropped scarf as if it had its own errands. Sometimes she came without it, running, laughing, her ribbons untied like small pennants of freedom. One wet afternoon, when rain hammered the park with a blunt, percussion-like insistence, the city seemed to shrink into itself and the pond became a mirror of a younger, angrier sky. He took shelter under the maples as he had grown used to doing. His coat streaked with rain in a way that made him look less designed and more human. She was there, bent against the wind, her braids soaked and her dress clinging, and she held the teddy by one frayed paw like a lighthouse keeper clinging to a life preserver. A woman approached them, the kind of woman who wears certainty like jewelry, sharp heels cutting the wet path with sound, and the air changed the way it does before a clap of thunder. She regarded the child and the man with a thin, inspecting look, as if cataloging their worth for reasons that had nothing to do with their humanity. "You shouldn't be here," she said, with a voice that made no question of its rightness. The little girl's wet face grew a bristle of stubbornness. Children learn early that some grown-ups must be contradicted. "This is a park," she told the woman, the facts of public space standing in for a moral stance. The woman laughed, a dry, brittle sound, and her eyes flicked to the man beside the child as if measuring him for a category he had long ago escaped but which she thought she could still manufacture. "This is a place for people like me," she said, indicating her own sleek umbrella as if it were an insignia. "And not for littering the ground with charity cases." The words were small, sharp stones. The man felt his breath compress as the woman leaned into a public cruelty that sought to perform moral superiority. The little girl's shoulders trembled, but she did not shrink. She had spent enough of her small life standing up to things that wanted to make her small. The man felt an old, reflexive rise of something, a corporate instinct to de-escalate, to smooth, to buy silence with an apology. But that instinct was being interrupted by something new and less calculable, the presence of a child's brave bear and the memory of being given it for free. He stood up then, careful and unassuming, and for the first time since his sister had been gone he felt his voice fall into a steadier register that was not of power but of protection. "This is a public park," he said simply. The words were not a negotiation. They were a refutation of an unkindness that had no right to citizenship. The woman's face hardened as if carved stone, and she took a step forward, her heel punctuating the sidewalk. "You should go," she said to the child. And when she said it, the implication was not merely that the child should leave the park, but that she should leave the public eye entirely, be made to feel ashamed for existing in a space that had been asked to accommodate her. The child's eyes filled with a tiny, sharp storm, and the man felt something awake in his chest that had been sleeping under a blanket of work and resignation. He could have responded with a businesslike dismissal, a card slid across a saucer of civility. Instead, he knelt down so that he was at the child's eye level, the bear between them like a treaty. He looked at the woman and saw, in her expression, a cruelty that was its own poverty. "She's allowed," he said, his voice low and clear. "We all are." The woman's lip curled in disgust, and she took out her phone as if to document an improper tableau, the modern-day gauntlet throw of a screen. Around them, other parkgoers paused, small instruments of the public's conscience tuning themselves to the pitch of things. The rain had stopped sounding like a punishment and began to feel like an audience. The woman scoffed and moved on, leaving behind the sharp echo of her words. The little girl exhaled as if she'd been holding the day together by her lungs alone. She hugged her bear to her chest, soaking its patchwork belly. The man reached out and straightened a wet ribbon in her hair, his hand lingering a millisecond longer than politeness required, a benediction rather than a gesture. For a moment, they were a quiet conspiratorial family stitched together by an unspoken code, defense of the small and the vulnerable. He walked the little girl to the edge of the park, refusing the triumph of being in the wrong place. Instead, he offered the quiet presence of someone who would be there if needed. She waved at him with the absent-minded trust of children who expect protectors to remain in place like lampposts. He watched her go until she disappeared into a smear of umbrellas and hurried footsteps, and then he waited a very long time on the bench until the maples were blue with evening and the city had folded itself into private rooms of light. He held the bear on his lap, which smelled faintly of cookie crumbs and a child's secret. He did not yet know that this small, seemingly insignificant day had altered the orbit of his life. He did not know that the child's generosity had reawakened in him a hunger to fix things beyond balance sheets, to step into people's lives not as a predator or an overlord but as a steady hand. But the seed had been planted, and the soil was no longer so dry. The afternoon light thinned to a fragile gold, and the park felt like a held breath, as if the city itself were waiting for something small and decisive to happen. The man sat where he always sat now, on the same bench where the ragged Teddy had found him and remade him, hands folded over the bear's threadbare chest as if guarding a secret. The park was a tapestry of quiet lives. An old couple feeding pigeons, a teenager with paint-smudged fingers sketching the play structure, a woman running with resolute, measured strides. Each figure was a small island of need and offering. He watched them, not as an outsider peering over glass, but close enough that their little miseries tugged at him like a familiar ache. He had learned to look. The little girl arrived in her faded floral dress, the same dress that caught the pockets of his memory like tiny hooks. Her hair was damp from the mist that had settled over the grass, and she clutched her own bear against her thin chest as if it were a map back to a safer place. When she saw him, she walked toward him with the same slow, solemn determination she had the day she offered him the bear. Up close, her eyes were clear and uncalculated, luminous as two small moons that had not yet learned to hide pain. "You came back," she said, and her voice had the soft finality of a pronouncement, not a question. He looked down at the bear in his lap and then at the girl, and there was a new steadiness in him, a patient gravity that surprised even himself. "I always come back," he said, and the words felt true, not because he had promised to, but because coming back had become a way to keep whatever change was inside him from slipping away. He had come back to the bench, to watch the park breathe and to watch the world give and receive small things. He had come back because the bear needed a place where light fell like a benediction. They spoke in the easy pauses between children's laughter and the distant rumble of traffic. She told him about the pattern of her days, how she fed the ducks with stale bread crusts, how she collected half-silvered coins in a dented tin, how she nicknamed the bench the listening bench because it listens good. He told her about his sister in fragments, the way grief had been a room with all the doors closed, how he had been accustomed to living with the windows latched and curtains drawn until the bear's small missing eye had given him a permission he did not know he wanted, to be seen. "You miss her," the girl said simply, as if she were stating the weather. He nodded, and the nod was not a concession but a recognition. He understood that children did not soften their words with the evasions adults invented. They held a truth like a clear stone. Their conversation dissolved into a companionable silence. Across the park, the woman with the umbrella watched from a distance, her presence a tight, cold line on the periphery of the scene. She lingered near the path as if waiting for evidence that the world conformed to her impatience. A dog darted by and she frowned. A cyclist cut too close and she clicked her tongue. She had been sharp the last time, a blade that made the little girl step back. The man's memory of that confrontation was a scar that had scabbed into something protective. He glanced up, and the woman's glance met his like a thrown gauntlet. She walked over with the purposeful glide of someone used to people rearranging themselves around her will. Her umbrella was immaculate against the soft raggedness that surrounded the bench. A black, glossy thing that looked newborn from a catalogue of impeccable things. The man felt the old, reflexive thread of fear tug at his ribs. Not for himself, but for the child whose small courage had already been taxed that morning. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said to the girl, voice cool and impeccable. "This park is not a place for—" She stopped, as though the proper insulting word did not adorn the edges of polite speech, and let disdain do the rest. The girl looked at the woman with a composure that had nothing to do with her size. "It's my bench," she said. "I sit here. I listen." The woman's smile folded like paper. "I think you should go home, hun. Your mother." At the mention of the girl's mother, the man felt something like an animal's need to strip an intruder of its weight. He rose, the bear in his hands, the fabric whispering. His voice was not the old corporate baritone, nor the flattened tone of bereavement. It was miraculously clear. "She's doing nothing wrong," he said. The umbrella woman turned to him with an expression of mild annoyance as at a minor inconvenience. "And who are you two?" He could have remained anonymous, as he had become in the city. An invisible man the doorman spoke to with economy, a figure on whose doorstep envelopes might arrive. He had learned the power of small, quiet kindnesses from the bear's gentle counsel. Today, however, anonymity felt like a coward's garment. There was an honest rawness in needing to stand as a thing that could be seen and judged and, perhaps, redeemed through action. "I'm someone who knows what it is to lose someone," he said. "And I know how hard it is to be told to move when you don't want to, especially when you have nowhere else you need to be." The woman with the umbrella took a breath like a metronome, as if she were measuring grievance. "This is a public space," she said. "There are rules. People like you shouldn't encourage." "People like us?" he repeated, and there was no bitterness in the question, only a cold surprise that the world could still classify sorrow like a stain. He put the bear on the bench between him and the girl. The bear sat like a small, sovereign monument, and the birdsong seemed to sharpen. The woman's lips tightened. She reached for the rebuke that might shame them in front of passers-by. But then something shifted, quite small and almost imperceptible, passed through the crowd. An old man who had been watching, leaning on his cane, now cleared his throat. A young mother with a stroller turned, frowning at the woman's cruelty. The teenager sketching in the corner closed his notebook and stood up, his jaw like a drawn line. The park is a place where reputations are small and fragile and can be swayed by a chorus of ordinary witness. "You have no right to tell a child where to sit," said the mother with the stroller. Her voice was not loud but held an authority of people who had felt that same indignity. Others murmured in agreement. The woman's face flushed a sudden, bitter purple, as if the air itself were pinching her. She threw the umbrella over her shoulder like a shield. "This is ridiculous," she declared, and for a moment her eyes met the man's in a way that was almost animal. "You have no idea what you are involving yourself in." He met her gaze with a steadiness he didn't know he possessed, and it was then that the small proof of everything began to assemble into a kind of ceremony. The bear sat between them like a token of courage. The little girl's hands folded in her lap, and in that simple posture there was a dignity so profound it made the man's throat tighten. "No," he said softly. "I think we do." The woman huffed, and with a last, sharp look she strode away, the umbrella stabbing the air like a repudiation. She marched off down the path, a black silhouette against the gentle afternoon, until she was only a memory of a disagreeable moment. The man watched her go and felt a curious, warm weight settle behind his ribs. It was not victory so much as recognition of the life he wanted to live. One that stood up for small people and held its hands open to give rather than to keep. After she left, the park released a small, collective exhale, and the old man with the cane shuffled over and sat at the end of the bench, close enough to feel part of something. He introduced himself as Mr. Halvorsen and spoke in the slow cadences of someone who had tasted many winters. He asked, as old men sometimes do, questions that held more memory than curiosity. The man listened and answered with careful honesty. Little stories braided together there. About a sister who had loved cinnamon buns and terrible romantic novels. About a child who had made a choice to give a thing away without asking for anything in return. Mr. Halvorsen nodded, eyes glinting. It takes a certain bravery to give a piece of yourself and not ask for it back, he said. I saw someone once, years ago, who gave his coat to a stranger in winter. He caught pneumonia that week. He stayed brave anyway. The world needs that stubbornness. The man thought of the small ways he'd already been stubborn. Leaving nickels on a stoop, paying for the coffees of people he did not know, slipping an envelope or two into the hands of someone who looked as if the world had decided to forget them. These acts had been anonymous at first, a private liturgy. They had made him feel like a vessel through which quiet redemption might pass. But now, surrounded by witnesses, the possibility of being known for kindness was no longer unbearable. He found he wanted to be accountable, not for applause, but to the promise the bear had coaxed from him, that grief could be turned into care. When the little girl rose to leave, she paused and looked at him as if measuring whether further worlds were possible. Then she stepped closer and put her hand on his arm for a moment. An ordinary contact, but urgent as a pulse. "Thank you," she said. He took her small hand and held it with both of his. It was the sort of contact that altered the pattern of a life. There was no grand pretense, no vow. Only the quiet commitment to be there in a way he had not been before. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring the bench its stories." She smiled then, a tiny, perfect crescent, and ran off toward the path where children were making forts out of fallen leaves. The man watched her go until she was a bright, moving thing among the trees, her dress a ripple of subdued floral against the brown of winter grass. That evening, he brought the bear to his apartment and placed it on the dining table as if it were an honored guest. The bear's one-button eye caught lamplight and seemed to glisten with approval. The man made tea, an old habit he had shared with his sister, and to his surprise found himself speaking aloud to the bear. He said the names of small mercies. He told stories of the park, of the woman who had stormed away, of Mr. Halvorsen's words. Talking to the bear was not childish. It was confession without spectacle. In the days that followed, his pattern was both comforting and inexorable. He rose early and made anonymous gestures, paying a rent that teetered in the ledger of a building 3 blocks away, leaving a winter coat for a man who lived outside the library, paying for the piano lessons of the girl on the corner who played too much by ear. He walked to the park and sat on the bench and listened. The bear rode on the bench beside him or in his coat pocket, its threadbare fur a small, steady companion. There were nights when grief returned like a tide, lifting him from sleep with the cold salt of memory. He would wake and reach for the absence that had become as familiar as breath. Sometimes he would find himself at the window, watching the city dissolve into drizzle, and he would feel the familiar hollowness. But now, after those nights, morning arrived like a promise. He would dress himself in the clean armor of modest action and go out again. This repetition healed less by erasing pain than by widening the space where pain could sit without swamping him. Weeks quietly unfurled into a winter that softened toward spring. The man found small things changing within him. His laugh was less startled and more willing, his appetite less mechanical, his attention less frayed. He discovered that grief, when offered outward, could teach generosity in a language the world understood. It turned out that mercy made him less alone. One day in early spring the girl did not come. He waited until the light thinned and leaves began to peer back into the world. He watched every child with the alertness of someone scanning a horizon for a ship that might carry a salvations. He left the bench reluctantly, as if he were abandoning a prayer. The next day she did not come either. On the third day the park felt smaller, like a room whose windows had been shuttered. He went to the place where the girl often played and saw the worn patch of dirt and a small, folded scrap of paper pinned beneath a rock, deliberate, childlike. On the paper were 2 lines written in a slanting, deliberate hand. "My mama has sick. I must help. I will come when I can." The man's chest tightened in the way it always had when small people carried burdens meant for shoulders far broader than their own. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Then he did what he always did now, he acted. He did not ask to be noticed. He gave with a quietness that would have been cowardice once, had the giving been a way to avoid the world. Now it was a way to engage with it, to be tethered to more people than his grief had assumed he deserved. He found the girl's address in the register of a community clinic, and he went. He brought groceries, real groceries, not the flimsy token city benefactors sometimes distribute. Bags filled with food a mother would be grateful to unpack. Rice heavy with the smell of jasmine, canned beans, fresh fruit, a thermos of soup. He left them on the stoop like a promise. Someone saw him leave the bags and assumed a reason. Rumors are what small cities are built from. They wrap around the truth and travel faster than the truth itself. But the man did not care. He felt the thrill of doing what had to be done without seeking sanction. The act fed him in a way loneliness never had. Days later, the girl returned to the bench with a quiet look of triumph and exhaustion. Her clothes were pressed and there was a new clarity in her step. "Mama is better," she announced when she sat down. She said thank you. She said the lady at the clinic said, "We didn't need to worry about the rent this month." The man felt the bear in his lap grow warm as if it had taken the scent of the girl's joy. He could not remember the last time he had felt this transparent and satisfied. The smallness of his previous measures, an envelope here, a tip there, had swollen into something that made a tangible difference. The knowledge settled in him like sunlight in a window. The world was not merely to be endured but to be tended. Then, as if the story had been waiting for its true test, the park announced a community fair to raise funds for the clinic. It was the sort of public gathering the city sometimes employed to bandage its own fractures. There would be booths, speeches, a small stage with local musicians. The man arrived early on the day of the fair, the bear tucked under his arm like an amulet. The woman with the umbrella came too, of course, dragging her polite indignation like a trailing hem. This time she wore a coat with a collar too high for the warmth of the day. She stood at one edge of the fair, overseeing what she presumed to be a charity event made clumsy by its participants. Then she saw the girl, alone near the table that sold lemonade, and something small and vindictive shone in her eyes. "Children shouldn't be used in these things," she said loudly, ensuring that a hush traveled like a ripple. What a spectacle! The little girl held herself steady, handing out napkins with the grave responsibility of one who gives time the respect of ceremony. A hush gathered around the words, and the air grew a little taut. The man felt a familiar pressure at his ribs. This was a moment that could escalate or be let slide. He went to the stage and asked, without ceremony, to say a few words. When he spoke, he did not unveil himself as a great benefactor. He did not reveal his name or his ledger. Standing at the microphone with the bear at his side, he told, simply and plainly, about a bench and a bear and a small girl's choice to give. He did not inflate the narrative. He let the truth be itself. "This little girl gave me a ragged bear," he said. "She gave it without asking for anything in return. It taught me to do a thing I had not known how to do, to act kindly without counting the cost to myself. Today I want us to honor that choice." A murmur moved through the crowd, and then Mr. Halvorson laughed softly from the front row. The woman with the umbrella's face hardened, but the presence of many people made her words fall flat. The man continued and, in his quiet way, he announced an anonymous fund to pay for 10 more months of clinic aid, starting now. He would underwrite scholarships for the piano lessons and the after-school tutors. He refused interviews and selfies and asked only that people open their own hearts in whatever way they could. The reaction was not theatrical. It was human. People turned to one another and cried, or clapped, or simply looked as if they had been taught something new. The little girl watched the man with wide, unguarded eyes, and then she climbed up on a crate and took the microphone. Her voice was small but clear. "Thank you," she said, and the audience seemed to lean forward. "My mama says thank you. She says there are good people." After the fair, as the park folded back into its ordinary rhythms, the man and the girl walked slowly toward the bench, and the bear sat between them like a bridge. They did not speak of promises or futures mapped in precise terms. They spoke of small things. The smell of spring in the gutters, the way pigeons clustered like a little council, the fact that Mr. Halvorsen always brought 2 cinnamon buns and never ate his second. The man's grief had not vanished. It was still a room he visited. But now the room had doors and a patch of sunlight on the floor where he could sit and drink tea and remember without being drowned. The bear had not performed miracles. It had been a mirror. It returned to him what the little girl had given and taught him to turn it outward. Time braided itself into a year. On a crisp morning that smelled of frost and beginnings, the man brought the bear to the bench and set it carefully on the slatted wood as if performing a ritual. The girl arrived, older by a wisdom that comes from carrying burdens that are never meant for a child. She reached up and hugged him, then reached out and hugged the bear. They sat and watched the park breathe out a silver breath. "Do you remember when you gave me the bear?" the man asked. She nodded, and for a second the world tightened to the circumference of that memory. "I thought maybe you were lonely," she said. "I thought maybe you would like a friend." He smiled. The way grief made things small sometimes softened into warmth. "You were right," he said. "I did like a friend." They made no promises beyond the obvious. To keep coming back to the bench, to keep noticing what needed noticing, to keep offering what they could. The man had learned to name his sister in the quiet of his apartment and to make space where her absence could be honored rather than erased. He had learned to let love be a thing of simple labor and small gestures. Paying a bill, answering a child's question honestly, sitting in the presence of pain without fleeing. Years later, when the city had rearranged a few things and life had bent him into someone less brittle, the man would sometimes walk the neighborhood and see the results of choices small and patient. There was a mural painted near the clinic, a child with a bear stitched into the corner of its smile. There was a scholarship plaque with no names except an embroidered bear in the margins. Families he had never met waved at him on stoops. Mr. Halvorsen would still be there, if his knees allowed, nodding like an ancient lighthouse. And on certain evenings, when the light thinned into a prayer, the man would take the bear down from the shelf where it sat like a relic and carry it to the bench. He would sit and listen to the park's soft hush and recall a sister's laugh, the way it used to scatter like coins across a tabletop. He would close his eyes and let the memory of generosity flow through him, not as currency to be hoarded but as a current to move others along. The little girl grew into someone whose hands were skilled at making things endure. She learned to measure the world not by what it denied her but by what she could give back to it. She became, in her own quiet way, a steward of small mercies. The man who had been given consolation with the simplest of tokens, a ragged bear with one button eye, never stopped being astonished that someone so young had been the instrument of his remaking. They never made a spectacle of the change. There were no ceremonies grander than a bench and a bear and 3 words spoken across a summer wind. "Thank you. Come back. We will." Those tiny gifts accumulated into a life. They were the kind of miracles that do not command trumpets but mend the seams of ordinary hearts. On the bench under the map of trees that had become a cartography of their story, the man kept the bear. Sometimes, when a new sorrow visited the park, a young mother's quiet panic, an old man's sudden collapse, he offered help without thinking, an instinct more than a decision. He had learned that the simplest acts could crack the hardest shells. He had learned to be present. Grief had become the soil in which empathy grew. If anyone asked him the story of how he changed, he would speak in the plain language of small, unglamorous things. He would tell about a girl in a faded floral dress, about a bear with a missing eye, about the way giving could unclench a heart. He would tell how embarrassment or pride had once been his chosen companions and how, by slow degrees, kindness replaced them. And sometimes, in the hush before dusk, he let himself imagine that his sister was sitting beside him on that bench, the two of them listening to the city breathe, and that she might be smiling at the bear and at the little girl, and at him for learning the simplest, hardest lesson. That to be human is to be given away and to give back, in smallness and in steadiness, until what remains is lighter than what was lost.